He didn't say goodbye when he left for work that morning. Not in the way that would have meant something. He just picked up his keys off the counter, let the door click shut behind him, and that was it. I stood in my Claire, 67 years old, and I'm Robert Sinclair, 67 years old, and I'm Robert 6 years. Some mornings are just mornings. I was 29 when I married my husband. I was finishing my master's in education policy. He was 3 years into a management consulting job that had him flying out to Dallas or Chicago or wherever the client needed him that week. We met at a friend's birthday dinner in Midtown, argued about whether New York-style pizza was actually better or just louder about being better, and he asked for my number before the check came. I thought he was funny. I thought he was the kind of person who would always show up. I wasn't wrong about the funny part. Looking back, I can identify the moment things started to shift. Not the big moment, not the one that eventually broke everything open, but the quiet one. The one I kept explaining away for months. It was a Tuesday in October, about 2 years into our marriage. He came home from a work trip to Denver, dropped his bag in the hallway, and sat down on the couch without even taking his shoes off. I had made dinner. Nothing fancy, just the lemon chicken pasta he used to request by name. He looked at the plate I set in front of him, looked at me, and said, "I'm not really hungry." Then he turned on the TV. He didn't ask how my week had been. I had defended my thesis proposal that day. I had been up until 2 in the morning for 4 nights in a row preparing it. He didn't know any of that because he hadn't asked. I told myself he was tired. Traveling takes it out of you. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I kept telling myself things like that for the next 4 years. His name is Owen. He grew up in suburban Connecticut, the kind of town with a main street that still has a hardware store and a diner that's been there since the 70s. His parents are still married. His mother used to send us care packages at Christmas, homemade cookies, a tin of soup mix, a handwritten card. I loved his family before I started to understand that loving his family wasn't the same as him loving mine. My mother asked me once, maybe a year before everything collapsed, whether Owen seemed happy. I said yes. She pressed a little. "Happy with you, I mean." I remember laughing it off. I said something like, "Mom, we're fine, we're just busy." She didn't push it, but she didn't look convinced either. I had given up a policy fellowship in D.C., the second year of our marriage, because we'd just moved into our apartment in Philadelphia and he said it wasn't the right time for long distance. I told myself it was a mutual decision. I told myself there would be other fellowships. There were, technically. I stopped applying for them. The calls started, I think, around March of that year. Little signs I kept cataloging and then quietly filing away somewhere I didn't have to look at. He started going to the gym at 7 in the evening instead of the morning. He bought 2 new shirts on a Saturday without mentioning it, which he had never done without a specific reason. He started laughing at things on his phone, and then putting it face down when I walked into the room. Not in a dramatic way, just carefully. I noticed every single thing. I just wasn't ready to name it. The night it became impossible to ignore was a Friday in April. I had gotten home early from work. I was teaching high school civics by then, and we'd had a half day for parent conferences. I changed into something comfortable, opened a bottle of Riesling, and started thinking about whether we should try the new Thai place on Walnut Street for dinner. I was actually looking forward to a quiet evening. I had missed him, which sounds strange to say about someone you live with, but I had. I'm Robert Sinclair, 67 years old, and he texted at 5:30. Just 6 words, don't wait up. Out with colleagues. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I put it face down on the coffee table, just like he'd been doing with his. He didn't come home until past midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the dark in the living room, the wine bottle long finished. He walked in and stopped when he saw me sitting there. Just stopped in the doorway, like he'd forgotten I existed. "You're up," he said. "Yeah," I said. "I'm up." He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He walked to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, and said he was tired and going to bed. I sat there for another hour after his light went out, listening to the city outside our window, thinking about the fellowship I hadn't taken, thinking about how the acceptance email had sat in my inbox for 3 days while I worked up the courage to turn it down, thinking about all the ways I had made myself smaller to fit inside the shape of this marriage. I asked him the next morning over coffee who he'd been out with. He said her name. He said it casually, the way you say the name of someone you've mentioned 100 times before. A colleague from the Chicago office. She'd been in town for a strategy session. I said, "You've mentioned her before." He said, "She's on my team." I said, "What's her last name?" He looked up from his coffee. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but awareness, like he'd just realized I was asking a real question. "Cassidy," he said. "Her last name is Cassidy." I nodded. I rinsed my mug. I went and got ready for work. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the weeks after that, because I think people expect it to be simpler than it is. I didn't fall apart. I didn't confront him. I didn't hire a private investigator or go through his phone or any of the things you think you would do. What I did was much slower and much stranger. I started watching him the way you watch something you've already decided to let go of. Carefully. Quietly. Without wanting anything from it anymore. I called my sister in early May. She lives in Austin, has 3 kids, runs a small bakery, and is the most practically minded person I have ever known. I told her what I suspected. She listened without interrupting, which is not like her. And when I finished, she asked me one question. "Do you still want to be married to him?" I didn't answer right away. That was her answer. She said, "Okay. Then here's what we're going to do." My sister had gone through a divorce herself 5 years earlier. She knew things I didn't. She told me to open a personal bank account in my name only, which I was embarrassed to realize I had never done in 6 years of marriage. We had always used joint accounts. She told me to start gathering copies of financial documents, tax returns, mortgage statements, retirement accounts. She told me to make a list of everything I'd contributed to the marriage and everything I'd given up. That list took me 3 evenings to write. By the end of it, I was shaking. Not with anger, with recognition. I had been so busy making things work that I had never stopped to look at what making things work had actually cost me. I saw an attorney in mid-May. Her name was Beverly, and she had an office near Rittenhouse Square with a ficus in the corner that looked like it had been there since the Clinton administration. She was direct, measured, and completely unsentimental, and I liked her immediately. She walked me through what a divorce would look like financially, what I was entitled to, what the timeline would be. Pennsylvania is an equitable distribution state, she explained. That meant the house, which we put down on together, whose mortgage I had contributed to equally for 4 years, would be divided fairly. I drove home from that appointment feeling something I didn't expect to feel, calm. Owen was in the kitchen when I got back. He was on the phone, and he turned slightly toward the window when I walked in, lowering his voice. He didn't see me standing there. I watched his shoulders, the way they curved in on themselves, and I understood something I hadn't before. He wasn't happy either. He hadn't been for a long time. And rather than say so, rather than try, rather than have a single honest conversation with me, he had just started looking for the exit without telling me where he was going. That was the part that hurt most. Not that he'd found someone else, that he'd stopped treating me like someone worth being honest with. I made dinner that night. I set the table. I asked about his day and he asked about mine, and we sat across from each other in our kitchen like 2 people eating dinner on a stage set, performing something neither of us believed in anymore. I think we both knew. I think we had known for a while. He told me on a Thursday, "I'm Robert Sinclair, Six City, 7 years old," and I'm Robert Sinclair. Six City was so careful about it, so measured, like he'd been rehearsing. He said he thought we'd grown apart. He said he loved me but wasn't in love with me. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he felt like he'd been living the same day on repeat for years and he needed something different. I let him finish. I had a glass of water in front of me and I looked at it the whole time he talked. When he was done, I said, "How long have you been seeing her?" The pause told me everything. He said it had started in February. It was now early June. I said, "I'd like you to move out by the end of the month." He looked surprised. I think he'd expected tears, maybe a fight, maybe some version of me begging him to reconsider. He didn't know I'd already spoken to Beverly. He didn't know about the personal account, or the documents, or the list my sister and I had made together. He didn't know that I had been quietly, methodically making sure I would be okay. Because I had learned, the hard way, that no one was going to make sure of that for me. He moved out on June 28th, a Saturday. His friend from college came with a rented pickup truck, and they carried boxes down 3 flights of stairs for 4 hours. I went to a coffee shop on Pine Street while they did it. I ordered an Americano and a croissant, and I sat by the window and I read 40 pages of a novel I'd bought 3 months earlier and never had time for. When I came back, his key was on the counter and half the apartment was gone. I stood in the middle of the living room, and I looked at the empty spaces where his things had been. The bookshelf with gaps in it. The nail on the wall where the print he'd gotten in Barcelona used to hang. The absence of his running shoes by the door. I cried. I want to be clear about that. I cried, and it was real. And it wasn't because I wanted him back. It was because 6 years is a long time to invest in something, and grief doesn't care whether the thing you're grieving was still good when it ended. The divorce was finalized in March of the following year, 9 months. Beverly said we were lucky it moved quickly. Owen didn't contest much. We split the equity in the apartment. I kept my retirement account, he kept his. We untangled our finances with the help of 2 attorneys and a mediator and a lot of paperwork, and it was tedious and exhausting and occasionally infuriating, and then it was done. I want to tell you about what happened in the middle of all of it, though, because that's the part that changed everything. In August, 2 months after Owen moved out, while the divorce was still in process, I got an email from the Civic Policy Institute in Washington. They were relaunching a fellowship program that had been on pause for 2 years due to funding. A former professor of mine had recommended me. The fellowship was for education policy professionals in the early to mid-career stage. Full stipend, 12 months, DC-based, with a research focus on civic education access in underfunded districts. It was almost exactly the opportunity I had, turned down 7 years earlier. I sat with the email for 2 days. I called my sister. I called my mother. I called my therapist, who I had started seeing in July and who had this way of asking questions that made me feel like she already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to catch up. She said, "What's stopping you?" I said, "Nothing, I guess." She waited. I said, "Nothing." I applied. I was accepted in October. I moved to DC in January. I found out through a mutual friend, sometime in the spring, that Owen and the woman from his office had broken up. Apparently, she had been transferred back to the Chicago office full-time, and the long distance had been harder than either of them expected. She hadn't wanted to move to Philadelphia. He hadn't wanted to move to Chicago. They'd given it 5 months. I can't tell you I felt nothing when I heard that, but what I felt wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It was more like recognition. The same quiet click of understanding I'd felt in Beverly's office that afternoon, looking at the ficus and thinking about my life. He'd blown up everything we had built for something that didn't hold, and I don't know what he does with that knowledge. I genuinely don't. That part is his to carry. What I know is this. I am 33 years old. I live in a studio apartment in Capitol Hill with too many plants and a standing desk I assembled wrong and had to take apart and reassemble twice. I take the metro to work every morning. I eat lunch with colleagues who argue about education reform the way I used to argue about pizza, with conviction and a lot of hand gestures. I am finishing a research paper that will be presented at a conference in Boston in the fall. I'm Robert sometimes and lonely sometimes, and I don't always know what my life is supposed to look like from here. But I know that it is mine. Every choice in it is mine. Every morning I wake up to is mine. Owen thought the life we had together was boring. Maybe it was by the end, but I've come to understand something about that word. Boring. He used it to describe a feeling that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with him. The restlessness, the reaching for something that felt more real, that was something he was going to carry no matter where he went. You can't outrun yourself by changing apartments. I didn't know that then, but I know it now. And standing in the atrium of a federal building on a cold morning in February, badge clipped to my coat, coffee in hand, watching the light come through the high windows and fall across the marble floor, I thought, this is what I walked toward, not away from something. Toward this, that was enough. That has always been enough. I keep coming back to the night I sat alone in our dark living room. The wine finished, the city humming outside, waiting for a man who had already decided I wasn't worth hurrying home to. I didn't know it then, not fully, but that was the night something in me stopped waiting for his permission to matter. Owen used to say I was the steady one. He meant it as a compliment, I think. But steady over time became invisible. I kept the appointments, the joint accounts, the shared calendar. I made the apartment feel like a home and then quietly disappeared into the background of it. And I told myself that was love. That showing up without being asked was the highest form of it. What I understand now is that love without honesty is just maintenance. And I had been maintaining something that hadn't been alive in years. There's a version of this story where I blame Owen for all of it. It would be easy to tell it that way, but the more honest version is that I had been complicit in my own shrinking. I turned down the fellowship. I stopped applying. I let myself believe that the life we were building together was more important than the life I had imagined for myself, and I never once said that out loud to him. Never once admitted I was keeping a tally, never once asked whether we were building something we both actually wanted. That silence was mine. I own it. What I've learned, and it took me a long time to be able to say this without flinching, is that clarity is something you have to be brave enough to seek, not just about the people around you, but about yourself. About what you've traded away and why, about whether the story you've been telling yourself still holds up when you look at it straight on. I wasn't ready to do that for a long time. Owen leaving forced my hand, and as much as that hurt, I can't say I'm sorry it happened. Beverly told me, in that first meeting, to make a list of everything I'd contributed and everything I'd given up. I cried writing it. But I also felt, for the first time in years, like someone was asking me to take my own life seriously. That list was the beginning of something. Not revenge, nothing so simple as that. Just accountability. To myself. My sister flew in for a weekend in August right after I got the fellowship email. We sat on my apartment floor with takeout containers between us and she said, "You were always this person. You just needed some room." I didn't argue with her. She was right. The room just had to be made the hard way. I think about Cassidy sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached curiosity. She didn't take anything from me. Owen had already checked out long before she came along. She was just the direction he was looking when he stopped trying. And when the novelty wore off and the practicalities set in, the distance, the logistics, the ordinary weight of a real relationship, it turned out that what he'd wanted wasn't her specifically. It was the feeling of wanting something. That feeling doesn't last. It never does. He carried that restlessness with him when he left. That's not something you fix by changing your zip code. I am still figuring out what my life looks like from here. Some mornings that feels exciting. Some mornings it just feels like a lot of open space. But I've stopped being afraid of the open space. I've started learning to move around in it. That's the thing no one tells you about starting over in your 30s. It doesn't feel like starting over. It feels like finally starting.